Joining us now to analyze today's breaking headlines is Cristina Mislan. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, the World Food Program is suspending food vouchers to nearly 2 million Syrian refugees because it has literally run out of money. Refugees fleeing the devastating civil war have made their way to the neighboring countries of Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt, and were surviving primarily on the WFP's donations of vouchers that they could spend in their host countries for food. The UN program has issued an urgent international appeal for the $64 million it will need to feed the refugees through this month. Meanwhile, Lebanon's government has announced it has captured the wife and son of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. The two were apparently attempting to cross into Lebanon from Syria. The U.S. has headed a 4-month-long military operation against ISIS that seems to have made little progress so far. Well, Cristina, I wonder what fraction of a single U.S. fighter jet it would take to feed 1.7 million Syrian refugees.
Well, we could definitely, probably assume that if U.S. fighter jets were used for other purposes, such as feeding refugees, instead of bringing mass violence to people living in the Middle Eastern region, 1.7 million refugees could be fed. But it's clear that the U.S. has no interest in finding solutions for people who had to leave a war that they very much lead. And so, but again, this shouldn't be a surprise if the U.S.-led wars in the Middle East have forced some of us, in many ways to confront the ongoing empire practices of this country. But it also seems to me that a story like this regarding the World Food Program raises one important question that needs to be addressed. And that question is whether we should leave it up to an international organization to ensure the survival of millions of people, or whether we should actually force governmental institutions to begin to look to other solutions that replace military occupations with more humane and peaceful strategies that really aren't only just to feed millions of refugees, but actually get them back to their homes.
And then the U.S. Supreme Court is facing a dilemma unique to our age of social media and online communications, and that is how to tackle threats made digitally. In the case of Alanis versus the U.S., a Pennsylvania man made elaborate and violent death threats against his wife on Facebook, and the Supreme Court justices must now decide whether those constitute exceptions to the First Amendment. In addition to its impact on domestic violence, the case is relevant to the recent controversy that became known as Gamergate, when female video game reviewers were threatened after criticizing misogyny in games. Online forums are popular avenues for male rage against women in general, whether in comment sections or on online social media sites. Well, Cristina, how significant is this case to you?
Well, anytime that we have a case that raises questions about violence on social media, it's important to put it into context. Let's understand that these questions aren't necessarily new, although the age of social media does raise more challenges. But just as violence, for instance, on television, film, music, video games, helps promote a culture in which people have become desensitized to violence, social media have also underscored how violence passed off as art, which makes this case even more interesting, can be defended and supported in this country. And so this, of course, has consequences, right? These consequences are manifested in this pervasive rape culture where violence against women is legitimized, dismissed, and even seen as a joke. So the significance of this case is that it provides more evidence for really illustrating just how violence is increasingly becoming part of our everyday lives. Even in the absence of physical war in our immediate environments, that realization should concern us all.
And finally, a day after President Obama met with a series of activist, faith, and law enforcement leaders regarding the ongoing tensions in Ferguson, Missouri, his administration has announced some policy changes. Among those are $75 million in funding for body-worn cameras for police officers and a task force to examine policing practices in the U.S. Some activists were disappointed he did not go far enough. Meanwhile, Attorney General Eric Holder also announced yesterday that the Justice Department will release new guidelines aimed at ending police racial profiling. A student campaign dubbed Hands Up Walk Out in dozens of cities across the U.S. yesterday resulted in a mass walkout at 12:01 p.m. Central, the time that Michael Brown was fatally shot by Darren Wilson. And 5 members of the St. Louis Rams NFL team who raised their hands in solidarity with Ferguson protesters have come under fire from police unions. The players have remained steadfast in their political protests, saying they refuse to apologize. Well, Cristina, how serious a turning point has Ferguson become on our national conversation on race and police brutality?
Well, just as violence permeates our online interactions, it does so physically, particularly in brown and black communities. The fact that the protests in Ferguson have lasted for at least 4 months is a testament to the endurance and spirit of the young activists we see today, every day on the streets of Ferguson and in every other major city in this country. So there is a serious turning point in this national conversation. But let's be clear about a couple of things. Obama's speech made last Monday did nothing to address the bigger problems that Ferguson points to. It's not only race, but also state power, militarization, and corporate interests that should be at the center of this conversation. So while Obama's meeting with activists is welcomed and a step forward, his proposals, for instance, the camera solution, do very little to address the bigger issues that would directly implicate his own national and international policies, which are also, by the way, racial. There are racial discourses and racialized implications here. But if we want to move this conversation even further, we really will have to force the president himself to come to terms with his own repressive military policies.
Well, Cristina, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.